Hi, my name's Sam. I'm the author of a fantasy novel titled Seas of Grief, and in this video, I'm going to teach you how you can take your world building to the next level with unforgettable cultures and rich histories that will make your world stand out from the rest. Stick around to learn the best way to come up with names for your fantasy world. Ever wonder why some fantasy worlds feel alive while others fall flat? The secret to building a believable world isn't magic. It's in the tiny details like names, cultures, and histories that tie it all together. One thing to consider before you begin building your world is how much world building you actually need to include in your project. If you're solely creating a world for the sake of creating a world, then obviously you shouldn't be limiting yourself at all. Just create as much or as little as you want. But if you plan to write a novel, for example, your world building process and destination may look a little bit different. One important thing to always keep in mind when world building is your project and your audience for that project. If you're world building for a novel, for example, or even a D&D game or a video game, whatever it be, your audience is likely not going to absorb all the world building information that you write. So it's important to remember that you're only showing your audience the tip of the iceberg. But the bottom of the iceberg, underneath the water, that most people aren't ever going to see is still important because it helps the tip feel real. You need that extra layer beneath that they aren't going to see, but it's also important to remember that they aren't going to see all of it. And so you don't have to pour your blood, sweat, and tears into the bottom layers if you don't want to. But then again, if you're just world building to world build, you should have no limits. By all means, world build that iceberg as deep as you want. Don't worry about the surface level and the what's underneath. Just world build. But again, it's important to remember your audience and remember how much they're actually going to digest of your world. For a lot of people, when they think about world building, they think of maps. Massive depictions of continents or even worlds, and this is where a lot of people start their world building journey. But I think this part of the process is often illustrated as more important than it needs to be. For my fantasy novel Seas of Grief, I didn't even make a world map or continent map. I did end up making small maps of certain locations so I could keep things consistent, but making mountains of maps isn't always necessary, especially if you're like me and it's a part of the process you don't particularly enjoy. Now, creating maps is often a really fun part of the world building process, but it can seem daunting for some people, especially if you're like me and have absolutely no artistic ability. But there is a really cool way that I've used called the rice method. Maybe you've heard of it. It's where you take a big poster board and you spread rice on the board, and then you kind of spread it around into continent looking things, and the rice will kind of just naturally create this kind of shape of land masses that you can use and then trace over your map, and then you can put your points of interest across the map. But that's a really fun way to do it. Another thing that I really love to use, they aren't sponsoring this video or anything, but it's a website called Incarnate. I love that website. I use it. I have the full version. If you don't have any artistic ability, I definitely recommend you get that one. It makes it really easy to build big, extensive maps. But yeah, also if you want to do a physical map, the rice method is so much fun, unbeatable. Even a combination of the two is oftentimes a lot of fun for different world building projects. One thing to consider when making maps is realistic and sensical geography. For example, the map of Middle-earth makes a lot of sense and could easily be mistaken for a real location on Earth. While realistic geography certainly does add a certain grounded tone to your world, you don't have to follow this rule. For my most recent Dungeons & Dragons campaign, I didn't care much for a realistic map, and instead wanted to make the most interesting continent possible for my players to mess around in. One strategy I use when building my maps is to focus on points of interest, unique ideas for locations with stories behind them, and taking inspiration from that history to fill the rest of the empty space in the land masses. A great example of this comes in the Avatar: The Last Airbender universe, where landmarks like Ba Sing Se and the Air Temples tell the story of how the Fire Nation took over, and the less important lands surrounding these areas helps to tell the story. For example, all the war ruins outside of the city of Ba Sing Se. One commonly talked about thing in world building is races, and the lack of unique ideas in most fantasy worlds. Be more imaginative than just your run-of-the-mill elves and dwarves. One strategy that I use is to try to build races off of a single concept, to make them engaging but also easy to understand in a broader sense. Then build off of that one aspect to create a fleshed out culture. One thing a lot of world builders try to stay away from is stereotypes and generalizing when creating their fantasy races. But I actually think this can be a very useful tool that can help races feel more defined and therefore real. And then in your project, going in and expanding upon the stereotypes and even going against them with certain characters or groups can add a lot to a race in your world. One world that excels at creating memorable races is the Zelda universe. Each of the main races is very distinct and easy to understand at a surface level. The Zora are fish people, the Gorons are volcano people, the Gerudo are a desert tribe of only women, and the Rito are bird people. But beneath the surface level, each race has a unique culture, history, and tone that makes them all feel real and distinct. But even still, in your travels in these games, you'll sometimes find exotic races outside their natural habitat, going against the race's stereotypes and making the individual characters feel more real and human.
Alright, names. One of the most commonly talked about aspects of world building. How to come up with names that don't suck. This is really fun for me because I really enjoy and think that I'm good at coming up with names. Here's a couple of my tips. The first one is make sure you're expressing tone through the name, okay? Now, this kind of takes some practice and just some feeling out, but I'll give you some examples. Star Wars is excellent at using names to express tone. I'll give you an example. The name Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker, Luke Skywalker, doesn't matter. That's a very grandiose, kind of heroic name, and by the name Skywalker, you can almost, even if you know nothing about Star Wars, you can already assume that those are probably the heroes of our story, the Skywalkers, or at least some grandiose kind of, characters that are in the story. But then you have characters like Han Solo, that name Solo automatically kind of suggests that he's, a lone wolf kind of character. Another one is Darth Vader, a very dark, just kind of eerie name with a lot of power with it. Now, it's kind of hard to figure out how to deliver these tones across, but when you come up with a name, you can kind of feel what kind of tone it has, and so you can decide whether that tone fits with the character or location or language or whatever it be that you are creating. And it's okay to be kind of on the nose and I don't want to say cheesy, but obvious with the tones that you're trying to portray. It's okay to have something that's evil have an evil sounding name, even though it's not necessarily realistic. It's more kind of immersive for the audience that's absorbing your world, and it's more engaging. So that's one of my tips. A second tip would be to use repeating linguistic patterns for recurring tones, themes, or cultures. So if you have some kind of organization or culture, their names should sound similar, and this can create a lot of immersion for your audience. And I know that kind of seems obvious, but you can kind of think of different recurring factors. I'll give you an example. In my book, Seas of Grief, the race called the Mercari, all of their names end with an A. Kova, Velia, they all end with an A. And the reason for that is there's a ceremony in which they're given a crest, which is a signia that puts them to the different family members, and then once they do that, they earn the A in their name. But across all Mercari names and locations, you'll always see that A returning, and that's just a really simple example of using linguistic patterns to create that extra layer of immersion, that extra layer of consistency within your world. And then one of my third and final tip with names, and possibly my favorite, is to take inspiration from real world foreign languages. A lot of my names in my books and my stories is just taking a word that describes that character in English, putting it into whether it be Japanese or Latin or Greek with Google Translate, and then reorganizing the letters, maybe adding a few here and there, and then you get a really cool sounding name that has roots back to different languages. You'll see this a lot in all sorts of stories. For example, The Hunger Games, Panem which is the name of that fictional world, is some kind of tie with the Roman Empire to kind of draw back on that. So there's linguistic patterns all around in names in fiction. So those are going to be my tips for names for your fantasy world. As far as creating histories and cultures with world building, one thing that is often overlooked is the power of myths. The idea that there are different interpretations of historic events within your world that influence cultures and traditions. One fantastic example of this technique is found in one of the YouTube videos from the YouTuber Rick's Creations, who does all sorts of world building stuff and has incredible videos that I highly recommend. But in his world, Tumian, the world is surrounded by massive, unconquerable walls. Naturally, there are tons of stories and myths of the wall, why it's there and how it got there, but no one really knows the truth behind these walls. This both creates incredible intrigue for consumers of the world building project, but also makes the world and its diverse cultures feel more grounded and alive. Rick's Creations does incredible world building stuff. Please check him out.
And actually, that's going to wrap up this video. So I really appreciate you watching. I'd love to hear in the comments any opinions, any thoughts you have about world building or about this video. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to talk to you guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you all for your support. Have a fantastic day, you guys.